You are listening to David Pawson podcasts. This is a series of 4 talks covering what the Bible says about Jesus' return, the day of judgment, the punishment of hell, and the reward of heaven, topics rarely spoken about today. In this series, David delivers a message of hope and also a warning to Christian believers. Part 2, the day of judgment.
Well, now we're talking together about the future, not about the immediate future, but about the ultimate future. And the 4 things we're talking about are the 4 certain facts, certain events of the ultimate future. Christians have usually called these the last things, and that refers to the return of Christ, the day of judgment, hell, and heaven. And in the next 3 talks, we're looking at some rather serious subjects. That's right. There are too many Christians today who want to lick the icing off the cake, who don't, or the jam out of the sandwich or whatever. They don't want the more serious side of Scripture. But we come now to the day of judgment. My wife and I were in Zurich recently, and we visited the Zurich Cathedral. And right above the west door, there is a striking stone frieze, which has been painted recently. It's a frieze of the Day of Judgment, and it shows many people being put on the right in white and many being thrown into the flames of hell on the left. There'll be a close-up of that photograph in the video to see, and here's a close-up of those who are being thrown into hell. In other words, that was put above the west door so that whenever you went to worship, you were reminded of the Day of Judgment as you went in. And it's good to think about it. I told you in an earlier talk that the return of Christ is the most frequent prediction in Scripture, but the second most frequent is the Day of Judgment. And if I just read 3 texts, that will be enough. Paul, again speaking in Athens on Mars Hill, said, God has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. Then we have another prediction of Paul's in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive good or evil according to what he has done in the body. And in the body means in this life. And here's another verse from Hebrews chapter 9, a very familiar verse, often quoted by preachers. It is appointed to men to die once, and after that comes judgment. In other words, every one of us has 2 appointments, neither of which we can put in our diary, because we don't know the date of either. One is the day of our death, and the other is the day of our judgment. It will not be the same day. In fact, for each individual, the day of our death will be a different date. That's the date that will be put on our gravestone if we have one. But the day of judgment is exactly the same date for everyone. So we each have these 2 appointments. And it is a wise person who thinks about both of them. If you only think about the one, the day of your death, that is more likely to make you sin. If you think about both, it is more likely to make you not sin. If you just think about the day that you die, then let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Let's make the most of every pleasure we can squeeze out of life while we can. But if you remember that after death comes that second appointment, when you are accountable for how you've lived here, then that should have quite the opposite effect on the way you live. It's not just numbering our days in quantity, but ordering our days in quality that is important. I find on the whole that people are no longer afraid to die. They're more afraid of the process of dying, especially if it's going to be prolonged or painful. But of death itself, I meet very few who fear it. They dislike it intensely, will put it off as long as possible, not talk about it. But I don't meet many who fear death, because most people today have stopped believing in that second appointment afterwards. It is that second appointment that gives us the fear of the first one, because the first appointment is the end of an opportunity to get ready for the second. Well, now, if we don't know the dates, they're not less certain, and we need to remember them both, as I've said. But we try and forget both. Why? Because both are profoundly disturbing. Neither brings us comfort to think either about the day we die or the day we're going to be judged. Yet if you think about it, deep, deep down, all of us believe that a day of judgment is absolutely necessary, that it's right. There is part of us that says there must be a judgment. And there are two things that lead us to that feeling. One is the injustice of life. Nobody in their right senses could ever say that life is fair or just. One of the first things children learn to say is, "It's not fair." And their faces screw up when they say it. And sometimes we go right through life saying it. I was invited to go and visit a man in hospital who wanted to see a priest. And the nearest thing they could find was a Baptist pastor. So I went and said, "What do you want to see a priest about?" He said, "Why has God done this to me?" I said, "What do you mean, what has God done to you?" He said, "Well, I'm in hospital, aren't I? What have I done to deserve this?" I said, "Have you never been in hospital before?" He said, "Never. I've lived a good, upright life." I said, "How old are you?" He said, 96. And I said, "You've never been in hospital before?" He said, "Never." "Why should God allow this?" I said, "How long are you likely to be here?" He said, 10 days. And here he was, this dear old man, surrounded by pretty girls, waiting on every need. Many men would give their right arm for that. And here he's saying, "Why has God done this to me? It's not fair, it's not fair." Now, life isn't fair. And there is no rational reason why some people suffer so much and other people suffer so little. David had this problem. He wrote a psalm all about it, Psalm 73. He said, "Why do the wicked prosper? Why do bad people die in a happy old age, peacefully in bed?" While he said, "I've tried to make my life pure and yet I suffer all day long." He said, life's totally unjust. And it is. In this world, the innocent seem to suffer and the wicked get away with it. It's the innocent who are knocked down by hit-and-run drivers. The guilty are not often found. So the injustice of life demands that someday things be put right, that evil people do not get away with it. And the answer of the Bible is there will come a time when injustice will be put right. And nobody will get away with anything. And deep down in us, we agree that that should happen. The injustice of life demands it. I was in Palermo in Sicily recently, and that's a city in which there are 200 murders a year. And while I was there, 41 mafia leaders were arrested and put on trial. And the jury found them guilty. And the judge acquitted all of them. Can you imagine the feelings there were in that city when that happened? People said, "Where is justice? Where is justice?" And they just become utterly cynical and lawless themselves because right obviously doesn't pay. That's the feeling of so many people. That's the first reason there's got to be a day of judgment in which wrongs are righted and which right is vindicated. But there's another reason why there must be a day of judgment, and that is the justice of God. It's not just the injustice of life that demands it, but the justice of God demands it. You see, God has allowed so much wrong to be done. He has allowed us to do so much wrong to others. He has allowed it and apparently turned a blind eye to it, but he hasn't. He has taken note of every little thing that's been done. You see, if God never punishes wickedness, he is not a good God. That's why there has to be a day of judgment, because he is a good God. And if he turned a blind eye for all eternity to the things that are being done, we could never call him good. He is also king of the universe, and it was part of the function of an ancient king to be the judge, the final court of appeal. Still to this day, all our justice in this country is done in the name of the Queen. It is a function of royalty to be the final court of appeal of justice. And God is king, and he is the final court of appeal. He is also judge. Yes, he is father, but he is king, and he is judge. And his justice demands that day of judgment. God is not mocked, says the Bible. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. There will come a harvest. There comes a day of reckoning, a day when bills will be paid. God may not judge us every Friday. In fact, one businessman, I said to him, "Why don't you fear God?" And he said, "Because God doesn't press me as hard as my other creditors," which was at least an honest reply. No, God doesn't press us, but one day he will face us. The justice of God demands it. This is a moral universe. But why a day of judgment on which all are judged together? Why does he not judge us at the point of death and decide then, when we die, whether we go to heaven or hell? Why doesn't he do that? Why have we all to wait, even after we die, until this day comes up? And the answer is really quite simple. If justice is to be done, justice must be seen to be done. It is of the essence of justice that it has nothing to hide. It is injustice that has to hide. And therefore justice must be seen to be done. It is to be public. That is why there is a press bench in every court in this land. In other words, righteousness must be seen to be vindicated. And therefore God has appointed a day of judgment, a public day of judgment, when his righteousness will be seen to be done, and no one will ever again criticize God for not being fair. There will be 3 vindications on that day. First of all, God himself will be vindicated. How often have we criticized God for the way he's run the universe? Why does God do this? Why does God allow that? Why did God let my baby die? Why did God let my parents separate when I was a baby? Why? And whenever we say that, we are saying, God, we could run this universe better than you do. We are actually criticizing his providential ways. We're saying, you're not a very good king. We could do a better job than you do. God has to be vindicated from all the criticisms that have been made of the way he's run the universe. One day we will see why he did what he did, and when we do, we shall understand that he was absolutely right. We shall say with King Nebuchadnezzar, that man who had to go mad for 7 years before he saw sense and acknowledged God. But when he did acknowledge God and got his sanity and his throne back, he said, everything you do, God, is right. Now, one day the whole world has to come to that conclusion. The whole world will have to be shown that God indeed is vindicated and that everything he did was right and everything he allowed was right. And indeed, it's part of our Christian hope that one day we will understand the things that we just don't understand now, partly because we're not God and we don't see things his way. But God will do right. Do you remember Abraham arguing with God about Sodom and his nephew Lot? And God said, shall I show Abraham what I'm going to do? That I'm going to destroy that city? And he showed Abraham, and Abraham said, God, supposing there are 50 people who are good in that city, would you destroy them along with the whole city? God said, no, I wouldn't. Well, supposing there were 45 good people in that city, would you destroy it? No. 40, 30, 20, 10. He's trying to protect his nephew Lot. He's trying to beat God down to saving the city for one man. And you know what Abraham says to God? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Now listen, when there are things you can't understand, you're really faced with the question as to whether your faith believes that God always does right. When you lost that baby, you couldn't understand why. Do you know God well enough to know that whatever he does is right and whatever he allows is right? Or do you say, why? I wouldn't have let that happen if I'd been God. Now, on the day of judgment, God will be seen to have done everything right. And what a relief that will be for us. Not only will God be vindicated on the day of judgment, Christ will be vindicated. You know what the world thinks of Christ at this moment. Most of them don't think he's worth their attention. In fact, they've turned his name into a swear word. And you'll hear the name Jesus Christ more on the lips of unbelievers than believers today. At places of work, they hit the wrong nail with a hammer and say, Jesus Christ. How dare they talk like that about him? But why do they? Because they're disappointed with him, they're disillusioned with him. They say Christianity's been in the world 2,000 years, and what good has it done? And people think Gandhi is doing more for the modern world than Jesus ever did. But one day Jesus will be vindicated. The last time the world saw Jesus, they saw him naked and dying on a cross. But on the day of judgment, they'll see him vindicated. And every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. And then God's people will be vindicated on that day. How Christians have suffered. I was shattered to find out how many Christians died last year for Jesus. Do you know how many Christian martyrs there were in 1990? If I said 3,000, would you be amazed? If I said 30,000, would you think I was going crazy? If I said 300,000, what would you think? Well, I've gone one too high in that last figure. The estimated figure I have seen is 286,000 people died for Jesus last year. And there has not been 1 year for 2 millennia during which people have not died because they loved the Lord. And the world has dismissed them. The world was not worthy. But on the day of judgment, God's people will be vindicated. And all those who suffered for him will be vindicated. Justice will be done and be seen to be done and be acknowledged by all. So that's why there's got to be a day of judgment. Yet in spite of all this, there is something in us dislikes the whole idea. Or to put it more honestly, we like the idea of a day of judgment for everyone else, as long as I'm excused. What we blame in others, we excuse in ourselves. We want to see them punished for the things we do. Isn't it extraordinary, our perverted outlook? And of course, science has given us two very good excuses for what we do. It's given us the excuses of heredity, and environment. Science of biology says that we're the product of our genes. The science of psychology and sociology is able to say it's the way we were brought up. Listen, it's become almost the in thing now to say, I'm not a sinner, I'm a victim, I'm a patient, I need healing, not forgiveness. I've sat through many court cases and I found at a certain stage the best way to try and get a man off was to get a psychiatrist to plead that he wasn't responsible for his actions, that he was the victim of the way he'd been treated. And then, of course, he can be given treatment rather than punishment. And we went through a phase when many judges were impressed with that plea. With those I've tried to help through court, I've said to them, take your responsibility, be a man. You see, every one of us is the result of the choices we have made. Did you know that everybody over 40 is responsible for their face? Now, some of you can afford to laugh, but others of you can't. If you're over 40 and you don't like what you see in the mirror every morning, you know who to blame. Up to 40, you've got the features that you were born with. Over 40, you've got the expression that you've given yourself. You are responsible for what you have become. I remember one man in the dock saying to the judge, Your Honor, I got into bad company. I notice he didn't say I chose the wrong friends. I got into bad company, or I fell into bad company, as if I couldn't help it. Listen, we know that people have risen far above their background and fallen far below it to say that that's the decisive factor. The real factor in the formation of our character is the choices we have made through life. And you and I are the result of those choices. And the day of judgment will reveal our responsibility. Let me say absolutely, categorically, you have nothing to fear if you fear being blamed for something you're not responsible for. God will never blame you for something you couldn't help. Never. But that's not what worries me. What worries me are the things I could have helped. Right? So you have nothing to fear about a miscarriage of justice on the day of judgment. Nothing. God will never blame anyone for something they were not responsible for. But he will blame us for those things we are responsible for. And as we shall see in a moment, the things that we didn't do are not just the things that we did. A little child said to the teacher at school, "Teacher, you wouldn't punish me for something I hadn't done, would you?" The teacher said, "No, of course not." "Well, I haven't done my homework," said the child, preparing the way. There are sins of omission as well as sins of commission. And we have the Anglican prayer, the things that we have done that we ought not to have done, and the things we have not done that we ought to have done. The real fear is not for those who say, "I'm not really wicked," but for those who say, "I know I really am." And the older you get, the greater that fear comes. Because the older you get, the more you know yourself. The more you realize what you're really like. Basically, you see, we are terribly self-centered creatures. And our first concern is usually our own feelings. Our second concern after that are other people's feelings. And the last concern of all is God's feelings. There are many people who have no idea that God has feelings too. And yet the Bible is full of God's feelings. I hope you have a Bible that distinguishes poetry from prose. In the Bible, prose looks like a newspaper column. Can't find any for the moment. Like a newspaper column with the print going right to the sides. But poetry, the words are printed in shorter lines and with gaps between. You know what the difference I mean. I hope you have a Bible that does that, because there's a very important reason why sometimes God speaks to us in prose and sometimes in poetry. When he speaks in prose, he is communicating his thoughts from his mind to your mind through prose. But when he's communicating his feelings from his heart to your heart, he uses poetry. Well, we do the same. When we're in love, we write poetry, because we want to express feelings rather than thoughts. And the Bible is packed with God's feelings. We find out the things that make him sad, the things that make him happy, the things that make him feel sick, the things that make him angry. The day of judgment is very much connected with God's anger. Now, there are two words for anger in the New Testament. One is for that slow, simmering anger that goes in, doesn't come out. It goes in and it goes deep and it's long. And the other word is for a quick, short temper that boils over quickly and is usually over quite soon. Now, I wonder which your problem is. Could I just see? Hands up those whose problem is the slow, simmering anger inside. People don't even know you're angry, but you are. And how many have the quick anger? And how many have both? And how many don't like putting their hands up in meetings? One. And which do you think is God's anger, the slow or the quick? Well, the answer's both. If I can use an illustration that ladies will appreciate. Have you ever put a pan of milk on the stove and then got occupied with your visitors or someone else? and suddenly the thing's boiled over. Now, if you had stayed and watched it, that wouldn't have happened, would it? Because you'd have seen the first bubbling, you'd have seen that simmering, and you'd have had it off the flames as quickly as you could before it exploded. But when your attention is off that simmering, it seems so quick until it's all over the stove and you've got to clean it all up. Now, God's anger at the moment is simmering. That's why many people are not noticing it. It's there, and all the symptoms are there that God's anger is upon us. If you read Romans 1, you'll find a description of what happens in society when God is angry with it. Simmering anger. It doesn't show too much in great disasters, but it shows in other things. It shows particularly that people develop uncontrollable appetites, that food and sex become obsessions. When God is angry with a society, people develop not only uncontrollable appetites, but unnatural relationships, and particularly homosexual relationships. It's all there in Romans 1. And that's what happens to their bodies when God's anger is on a society. What happens to their minds is that minds develop antisocial behavior. And there's a list in Romans 1 that could have been taken off any police desk blotter of antisocial attitudes: rebellion against authority, disobedience to parents. There's a whole long list there of rebellious attitudes which virtually lead to a violent society, a lawless attitude. Now, if these are the symptoms of God's simmering anger, he would be a bold man who would claim that God is not angry with Britain today. The signs are there for people who look. But most people don't even think that God has feelings, therefore they don't notice this simmering anger. But the concept in the New Testament of the Day of Judgment is that is the day when the anger of God boils over. It's called the day of his anger, or the day of his wrath. It's the day when finally his anger so explodes that people know he's angry, whether they'd noticed it earlier or not. Now that's an interesting insight into the day of judgment, the day when God's anger shows. And we're even told this, that on that day, people will cry out to the mountains, "Fall on us," rather than face the expression on the face of God and his Son Jesus. Save us, fall on us to the mountains, so that we don't see the wrath of the Lamb and of God. Well, I told you earlier about earthquakes. Can you imagine a situation in which people would rather be crushed in an earthquake than face the anger of those two persons, Father and Son? It's a sobering description. Now, Romans 1 leads to Romans 2, and Romans chapter 2 tells us a great deal about this day of his wrath and says, notice his present anger and deal with it now, or deal with the cause of it now, so that you're not storing up his anger for the day when it boils over. Here are some of the things that Romans 2 tells us. First, the day of judgment is for everybody, without any exception. All human beings who have ever lived are going to be resurrected. Resurrection is not just for the righteous, it's for the wicked as well. Everybody is going to get that new body. And following the resurrection of all, the judgment of all takes place. Doesn't matter whether you're great or small, high or low, whether you were well-known and famous or nobody knew you, it doesn't matter. And each person will be dealt with personally. You will not have anyone to stand by your side on that day. You stand alone. You will not be able to hide behind anybody on that day. You stand alone. And that's one of the clearest teaching of Scripture, that we each, even though we're all together on that day, each is dealt with entirely separately, separate from your relatives, separate from your friends, alone. So first, it is for everybody. Second, we're told there, as I've already mentioned in an earlier talk, Jesus will be the judge, not God, but the human Jesus will be the judge. I'm not sure that that comforts me greatly, because if there was one person who could see right through people, it was Jesus. He knew everything that went on inside people's hearts. Thirdly, what kind of evidence will be looked at in the judgment? What kind of evidence will determine whether we are acquitted or found guilty? Well, let me tell you what the evidence will not be. The evidence will not be your appearance, not how you've appeared to other people, because frankly, most of us can fool others, not maybe all the time, but you can fool other people by your appearance. You can put on a front. You can hide your feelings. You can put a privet hedge up outside and lace curtains. But in that day, appearance will matter nothing, because God does not look at the outward appearance. Secondly, the evidence will not be your profession. There are many people who profess to love the Lord, many people who profess faith, many people who say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons in your name? All that's profession. But on the day of judgment, what we profess is totally irrelevant. What we say about ourselves is not considered. Third, the evidence will not be our reputation. We won't be able to say, well, Jesus just talked to so-and-so. They have a different opinion about me. Reputation will matter nothing on that day. So what will be the evidence? The answer is two things: our deeds and our words. What we've done, what we've said. The Bible says that if you've never said the wrong thing, you're absolutely perfect. So there's a very good test for you to apply as to how sanctified you are. I wonder how many of us would be happy if there was a big screen behind me now and everything we had done had been filmed and was now being shown to everybody else here. Or supposing if everything we had said, even in private, had been tape recorded and was being played to everybody here. Wonder how many friends would be left here for a start. Jesus said, for every idle word we will be brought into judgment. That's quite a thought. The idle words are those that slip out when we're not controlling our tongue properly, that slip out when we're overtired or when we're angry. For every idle word will be brought into judgment. This is the evidence. And God is absolutely fair. He has no favorites whatever. Now, I suppose one of the most serious things Jesus said about the day of judgment, he said it will be the day on which the secrets of men will be judged. He put it another way when he said what has been whispered in the bedchamber will be shouted from the housetops. The day on which the secrets of men will be judged, not the things that the world saw, the things that only God was aware of. Well, I told you it wasn't a comfortable subject. The next thing that we're told is this, that God is so fair and so just that he will only judge people by the light they have received. And this is the answer to all those queries, what about those who've never heard? How often people have said to me, well, what about those who've never heard about Jesus? And I say, do you want to become a missionary? And I find that those who keep asking me about those who've never heard do not want to go and tell them. They're only trying to find fault with Christianity. They have no real intention of going to share the good news with those who've never heard. But the answer of the Bible is absolutely clear. Those who've never heard will not be condemned for not hearing. In fact, Paul says quite clearly, those who've only heard the 10 Commandments will only be judged by the 10 Commandments. Those who haven't even heard the 10 Commandments will be judged only by what their conscience already has told them is right and wrong. Now, isn't that fair? Absolutely fair. God will only judge according to the light that has been received. The problem is that everybody has received some light. And in two particular ways, says Paul, they've received light from their conscience within and from the creation outside. And from the creation outside, they must know there is a greater power than themselves. And from their conscience within, they must know that that greater power is a moral power and concerned with right and wrong. So all a person need do to be acquitted before God is to say, God, I have always done what my conscience told me was right. That's all. But who can? That's the problem. See, every single person on earth has a concept of right and wrong. The Bible says that's God writing his law in their inner heart. And the proof that everybody has a conscience is that they're jolly quick to tell other people when they're wrong. You ever noticed that? If God only judged you for what you said was wrong in other people, that would be enough, wouldn't it? But we're so quick to condemn in others what we've done ourselves. Indeed, psychologists tell us that we're more ready to criticize in others what we either do or want to do ourselves. So, those brought up in Christian countries will be judged by the light they have received. Those brought up in the Jewish faith will be judged by the light they have received. Those brought up as pagans will be judged by the light they have received, because all have received light. And this is why there are degrees of punishment in the Bible, why it is more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than Capernaum, because Sodom and Gomorrah never had Jesus and they never saw his miracles, but Capernaum did. And though Sodom and Gomorrah have disappeared off the face of the earth, so has Capernaum and Bethsaida and Chorazin. But they had much greater light, and they are judged by that light. So God will never, ever judge you for what you didn't know or for the light you never received. The problem is that every one of us has had enough light to know that right is right and wrong is wrong, and we've not done it. So what's the verdict going to be on that day? There can only be one. Everybody's guilty. It's the only verdict there could possibly be. So why go through the whole rigmarole of a day of judgment just to find everybody guilty? When all those books are opened, do you watch This Is Your Life? Most of the time it's very interesting. There was a man on This Is Your Life whom I knew personally, and I knew he was a crook. He was an employee of my grandparents, and I knew what he was like. And yet on this Is Your Life program, he was a hero. He was a saint. The most uncomfortable sitting there watching. And if you read the articles that are written about that program, they discover all kinds of horrible things. The researchers really dig it out. And then they censor it carefully. Pick out all the nice bits. Listen, one day a book will be opened. This is your life. And there's everything in that book, not just the nice bits, not just what other people have thought or thought of you or seen. There's everything there. How will you feel? Well, listen, I've got good news for you. There's another book that will be open on the Day of Judgment. It's called the Lamb's Book of Life. It's a book full of the names of bad people, but they've all become relatives of Jesus. And they got written in his book under his name, and he can be acquitted because he lived the only perfect life that's ever been lived. And to get my name under his and into that book, that's the only hope I've got on that day. I'm going to say in the next talk that I'm afraid you can get your name blotted out of that book. But if your name stays in that book and is there on the Day of Judgment, then you are acquitted. Isn't that incredible? I'm going to tell you why that is possible in the later talks. That's the only hope for me or for you or for anyone else, that on that day when those books are opened, and the book This Is My Life is opened, the only hope I have is that my name is still in that other book, and it's under Jesus' name, and covered by his life, not mine. And then God can acquit me. Well, I think it's healthy to think about the Day of Judgment. It's healthy to remind people that we all have these two appointments. One, the day we die, and following that, the day we all stand together before God and give an account of how we've lived down here. What lies beyond that day? Well, there are only two possibilities, since there are only two possible verdicts, guilty and innocent. And we're going to be looking in the next two talks at what happens to the guilty, and then we shall finish up with what happens to the acquitted. See you next time.
You have been listening to David Pawson's podcasts. Other talks in this series and other free teaching resources can be downloaded free of charge by visiting www.davidpawson.co.uk.